Hello, this short webinar is titled Separation of Church and State, where the phrase comes from, a deeper comprehensive view, and I believe you'll benefit greatly from this deeper understanding. Well, the Danbury Baptist Association wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson after the 1801 inauguration of Thomas Jefferson as president, and this is what they said. Among the many millions in America and Europe who rejoice in your election to office, we embrace the first opportunity to express our great satisfaction in your appointment to the chief magistracy in the United States. We have reason to believe that God has raised you up to fill the chair of state, and out of that goodwill which he bears to the millions which you preside over. May God strengthen you for the arduous task which Providence and the voice of the people have called you, and may the Lord preserve you safe from every evil, and bring you at last to his heavenly kingdom through Jesus Christ, our glorious mediator. So they were saying congratulations, and really speaking to Jefferson's appointment as God's providential activity in American history. However, in that same letter of congratulations, the Baptists also expressed to Jefferson their grave concern over the entire concept of the First Amendment, including its guarantee for the free exercise of religion. This is what they said. Our sentiments are uniformly on the side of religious liberty, that religion is at all times and places a matter between God and individuals, and that no man ought to suffer in name, person, or effects on account of his religious opinions, and that the legitimate power of civil government extends no further than to punish the man who works ill to his neighbor. They continue, but sir, our constitution of government is not specific. Therefore, what religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, we enjoy as favors granted and not as inalienable rights. And so note here that they were appealing actually to a phrase from the Declaration of Independence, even as they write to Jefferson about the Constitution. They saw that the two documents worked together. To summarize their concerns here, they were saying that, in short, the inclusion of protection for the free exercise of religion in the Constitution suggested to the Danbury Baptist that the right of religious expression was a government-given right, thus it was alienable. That means the government could take it away, rather than it being God-given, which is inalienable. And so that had some concerns that the government might someday attempt to regulate or take away religious expression. And so it was into this letter that Jefferson responded on January 1st, 1802. And this was his response. Gentlemen, the affectionate sentiments of esteem and approbation which you are so good as to express towards me on behalf of the Danbury Baptist Association give me the highest satisfaction. And so first of all, he's thanking them for their good wishes and their observation that God appointed Jefferson for this providential time and place to lead the country. Jefferson continues, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, and that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Now here's an interesting question. Why did Jefferson use this phrase, wall of separation? The Danbury Baptists had not used it in their letter. The answer speaks to the sheer intellectual horsepower of Jefferson and the other founding fathers. Jefferson was weaving into his answer this phrase because over 100 years before this correspondence, the founder of the first ever Baptist church in America, Roger Williams, used this analogy in his writings. This truly does speak to the greatness of Jefferson and the other founders and the small-mindedness of much of today's intellectual establishment. A brief history of Roger Williams will reveal this truth. Who was Roger Williams? Well, he lived from 1603 to 1683. He was an English Protestant theologian, and he was an advocate for religious freedom. He founded the first Baptist church in America in Providence, Rhode Island, and he died 100 years before the Declaration in the U.S. Constitution. His garden wall analogy came out of his writings and beliefs. He believed that soul liberty, that is, freedom of conscience, was a gift from God. And Williams was the first to use the phrase, the wall of separation, to describe the relationship of the church and state. This separation was to keep the state's power in check, that there should be a wall of separation between the garden of Christ and the wilderness of the world. And this is what he actually said specifically. When they, that is church leaders, have opened a gap in the hedge or wall of separation between the garden of church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever broke down the wall itself. And that therefore, if he will ever please to restore his garden and paradise again, it must of necessity be walled in peculiarly unto himself from the world. Well, what is he saying here? In essence, he's saying this. If the church opened itself up to the world and wanted to be worldly, God would let the church go that way, and the church would be worse for it. But for the church to be all that God has called it to be, it cannot be worldly. It must keep itself dedicated to Christ and not prostitute itself to the world and allow it to become like the world. It needs to nurture and protect that focus on Christ like a garden wall protects the beauty of a garden. So the garden of Christ equals the faith and worship of the church and the inner life of man. And he was saying that government has no authority over this area or over this sphere of concern. The garden of Christ, the inner life of man, is reflected in the first 5 commandments of the 10 commandments. And Williams would make the case that there needed to be a high and impenetrable wall of protection from coercion of the state in the area of faith and worship. In other words, the state could not force people in how they would worship God or honor God, or what constituted blasphemy, or how to keep the Sabbath holy, or honoring of mother and father. To enter this realm would be coercive if the state mandated certain forms of worship and honor. However, Roger Williams also believed that the external commands, even the part of the 10 Commandments that dictate the actions of man, the state had a role in upholding these and punishing. The state has a role in punishing the breaking of these commands. The church calls upon the state to fulfill its duty and enforcement, and those commands would be: do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not lie or provide false testimony. So to summarize these thoughts, we could say this. These positions would be consistent with a state that appeals to and seeks to live up to the 10 Commandments. What it comes down to is enforcement. The state has no role in enforcing coercively the inner beliefs of individuals or churches, but the state has a very specific role in restraining and punishing exterior actions. And so all of this was built into Thomas Jefferson's idea of building a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson quotes here what the First Amendment actually says, and then appeals to the first Baptist minister of the Baptist faith in writing a letter to the Baptists in response to their concern. And this is pure genius and pure intellectual understanding that Jefferson had, and showed his greatness. The modern Supreme Court, though, today, and the federal courts, along with much of those serving in the governing of society, have twisted this phrase to mean exactly the opposite of what Jefferson meant in writing it. And so they've lifted this phrase out of Jefferson's letter, reversed what its meaning is, and then put that political philosophy out in society. It's interesting to note that in this same letter, there's another phrase here, that legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, that if the court were to do the same thing and lift these letters, or this sentence out of Jefferson's letter and interpret it correctly, they would see that it lays waste to the modern concept of hate crime legislation. In this one sentence, Jefferson demolishes the argument for so-called hate crimes legislation. Government does not have power to police thoughts, only actions. True justice is where actions are punished equally. Tyranny exists when those in power begin to pick and choose those who have preferred protection and claim the ability to divine and judge what is taking place in a person's heart. So again, it's interesting to note that a phrase, separation of church of state, is lifted out of Jefferson's letter and interpreted incorrectly and put on society. Meanwhile, out of Jefferson's letter, something that's very clear is left to lay there as our society soldiers on with unconstitutional legislative ideas. I hope this more comprehensive understanding has given you some extra food for thought in this idea of separation of church and state and where the phrase comes from. Please sample some additional items in this series for a greater understanding. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for listening.